I'm going to tell you something that completely changed the way I see this entire conflict, and honestly it's not what the headlines are saying. Because while the world is being told one story, a story of control, dominance and stability, what I've been tracking over the last 24 hours tells a very different reality. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Over the past day, I watched something unfold that didn't feel like a random escalation. It felt organized, calculated and deliberate. Two massive waves of coordinated strikes were launched back to back. But what caught my attention wasn't just the number of attacks, it was where they were hitting and how precise they seemed. We're talking about targets spread across multiple countries at the same time, not just military sites, but deeper infrastructure, command centers, naval positions and logistical networks. That's when I started asking myself a serious question. If these operations were really happening at this level, then why does the public narrative still sound like everything is under control? Because from what I could see, this didn't look like a weakened force acting out of desperation. It looked like a system that was still fully functional, still coordinated, and still capable of reaching far beyond its borders. And that's where things started to get even more interesting. Because once I dug into the details of the first wave, the picture became a lot clearer and a lot more unsettling. So I started digging deeper into that first wave, and what I found didn't line up with what we've been told at all. One specific strike stood out to me. It wasn't random, it wasn't symbolic, it was surgical. From everything I could piece together, the target was a highly sensitive, American-linked command facility, not out in the open, not in a war zone, but located in a region that's supposed to be secure, protected, untouchable. And yet it was hit. Not just hit, but hit with precision. We're talking about a coordinated attack that didn't rely on just one method. It combined different types of weapons in a way that suggests planning, timing, and real-time intelligence. This wasn't guesswork, this was calculated. And here's the part that really made me pause. You don't hit a location like that unless you know exactly where it is and what's inside it. That means someone had eyes on it, data on it, patterns mapped out, which raises a bigger question I couldn't ignore. How deep does that intelligence go? Because if a facility like that can be identified and targeted, then it challenges this entire idea that certain zones are safe just because they're far from the front lines. And then came the aftermath. Reports started surfacing about emergency responses rushing to the scene quickly, quietly, almost like something serious had just happened, but without any official acknowledgement. That silence, it felt louder than anything else, because when something doesn't get talked about, that's usually when it matters the most. And just when I thought that was the peak of it, the same wave delivered another message, this time not to a military target, but to something far more global. Just when I thought that first strike was the main story, something else happened that completely shifted the picture. This time it wasn't a hidden facility, it was a ship. A commercial vessel sitting at port, not in open battle, not actively engaged in combat, and yet it became a target. What struck me wasn't just the attack itself, but what it represented. Because hitting a vessel like that sends a very different kind of message. It's no longer just about military confrontation, it's about reach. From what I could gather, the strike was fast, precise, and intentional, not something random or accidental. It was aimed in a way that suggests the target had already been tracked, identified, and selected ahead of time. And that's when it really hit me. This wasn't just about showing strength on the battlefield. This was about signaling that economic lifelines, trade routes, shipping networks, global movement are no longer off limits. And here's the part that makes it even more complicated. The location. This didn't happen in a direct war zone. It happened in a place that technically isn't supposed to be part of the conflict, which raises a serious question. If assets can be targeted even in neutral or semi-neutral spaces, then where exactly is the line anymore? Because once that line starts to blur, the impact doesn't stay regional, it becomes global. Shipping companies start thinking twice, insurance costs rise, routes get reconsidered, and slowly, without any official declaration, the pressure spreads far beyond the battlefield. At this point I realized something important. These actions weren't random escalations. They were calculated signals, each one expanding the boundaries of the conflict just a little further. But what came next wasn't just a signal, it was a shift in control itself. Up until this point, everything I had seen felt like escalation, but what came next, it felt like something much bigger, because this wasn't about striking a target anymore, it was about controlling movement itself. I started seeing reports that ships moving through one of the most critical waterways in the world were no longer just passing through freely, they were being stopped, redirected, and in some cases told to wait. Think about that for a second. Not a full shutdown, not an official blockade, something more subtle, but just as powerful. A system where movement doesn't stop completely, it just becomes conditional. And that's what really caught my attention, because when control becomes conditional, it means someone else is setting the rules in real time. From what I could piece together, vessels were being monitored closely. Some were allowed through, Others were redirected to specific holding points. No chaos, no panic, just controlled pressure, and that's what makes it so effective. Because instead of triggering an immediate global reaction, it slowly forces everyone involved to adjust quietly, strategically. Shipping companies start calculating risk differently. Governments start reassessing their dependencies, and suddenly a route that once felt guaranteed starts to feel uncertain. That's when it clicked for me. This isn't about shutting anything down. It's about proving that it can be controlled whenever needed. And once that idea becomes real, it changes everything. Because now every country that depends on that route has to factor in one new variable they didn't have to think about before. And here's the part that makes it even more intense. While all of this was unfolding at sea, another wave was already being prepared. And this one, it wasn't just about pressure. It was personal. Up to this point, everything I had been tracking felt strategic, calculated, almost methodical. But then the next wave hit, and the tone completely changed. This one didn't feel like just another operation. It felt like a response, a message, something personal. From what I could gather, this wave was launched shortly after a high-profile loss on one side, and instead of slowing things down, it triggered something bigger, faster, more aggressive, and a lot more direct. Multiple targets were hit again, but this time the pattern looked different to me. It wasn't just about infrastructure anymore, it was about impact. There were reports of strikes on moving assets at sea, and not just any assets, high-value ones. And that's where things started to feel unpredictable. Because hitting a moving target, especially one that's heavily protected, isn't simple. It requires timing, tracking, coordination, and confidence that the strike will actually reach its target. Which tells me one thing: this wasn't rushed, this was prepared. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. There were claims, unconfirmed but persistent, about a major naval asset being forced to pull back after coming under attack. No official confirmation, no clear acknowledgement, just silence and scattered reports. And by now I've noticed a pattern. When something is completely false, it gets dismissed instantly. But when something sits in that gray area, not confirmed, not denied, that's usually where the real story is hiding. Because think about what that would mean. If a high-value asset can be targeted, even if not destroyed, even if just pressured enough to retreat, it changes the entire risk calculation. It means presence alone is no longer enough. It means positioning doesn't guarantee safety. And most importantly, it means the battlefield isn't as one-sided as it's being presented. By this point, I wasn't just looking at isolated events anymore. I was looking at a pattern, a system, something that was expanding, not slowing down. And what came next made that pattern even clearer, because the focus shifted again, from targets to the entire network behind them. At this point, I stopped looking at these events as separate incidents, because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about hitting targets anymore. It was about going after the entire system that supports them. What I started noticing next was a shift in focus, away from frontline positions and toward the deeper layers behind them. Facilities, production sites, support bases, places that don't usually make headlines, but quietly keep everything running. And that's when it really clicked for me. If you disrupt the network, you don't just weaken operations, you slow everything down. From what I could gather, some of these locations weren't even directly involved in active combat. They were part of the broader infrastructure, the kind that exists in the background, assumed to be safe. But now, that assumption didn't seem so solid anymore, because once those kinds of sites start getting attention, the pressure spreads. It's no longer limited to one battlefield. It reaches into multiple countries, multiple systems, multiple layers of support, and that creates a different kind of tension. Not immediate destruction, but sustained uncertainty. Every location that plays a role, no matter how indirect, suddenly has to ask, are we still out of reach? Or are we already part of this? And here's what makes that so powerful. You don't need to hit everything. You just need to prove that you can. Because once that possibility exists, it forces everyone to think differently. Governments, military planners, even private sectors tied to logistics and production. And slowly, without a single announcement, the cost of involvement starts rising. That's when I realized something even bigger. This wasn't just escalation, this was expansion. The battlefield wasn't growing outward randomly, it was being extended deliberately into every layer that supports it. And just when that realization settled in, another dimension of the conflict became impossible to ignore. Because it wasn't just happening on land or at sea anymore, it was happening in the skies too. Up until now, everything I had seen was happening on the ground or at sea. But then I started noticing something else, something that didn't match the narrative at all. The airspace, because from what we're constantly told, control of the skies is supposed to be absolute, clean, dominant, uncontested. But what I was seeing didn't look like that. Reports began surfacing about aerial assets being intercepted, surveillance platforms not making it back, operations in the air facing resistance, and not occasionally, regularly. That's when I paused and thought about what that actually means. Because true air dominance isn't just about having more aircraft, it's about operating freely, without fear of being challenged. And if assets are being tracked, engaged, and even brought down, then that freedom doesn't really exist. At least not in the way it's being described, which changes the picture completely. Because now it's not just land routes or sea lanes under pressure, it's the skies too. And when all three domains, land, sea, and air, start showing signs of resistance at the same time, that's not coincidence, that's structure, that's coordination. And suddenly the idea of one side having complete control starts to feel outdated, or at the very least incomplete. By this point I wasn't just questioning individual claims anymore, I was questioning the entire framework being presented, because if the skies aren't fully controlled, if movement at sea is conditional, if infrastructure across the region is being targeted, then this isn't a short-term situation, this is something much deeper, and that realization leads to the biggest question of all. Was this ever meant to be a quick outcome, or was that assumption wrong from the very beginning? By now I had stepped back and looked at everything together, the strikes, the shifting control at sea, the contested airspace, the expanding targets, and one thought kept coming back to me. This doesn't look like something that's ending anytime soon, because if you really think about it, most operations like this are designed with a clear expectation, fast results, a quick surge of pressure, overwhelming force, and then a decisive outcome. But what I was seeing didn't match that pattern at all. Instead of slowing down, everything was continuing, wave after wave, response after response, no sign of collapse, no sign of retreat. And that's when it hit me. What if the original expectation was wrong? What if this was never going to be quick? From everything I could piece together, it seemed like the early strategy may have been built around a short timeline, the idea that intense pressure at the beginning would force a rapid shift. But that shift, it never really happened. Instead, the response adapted, stabilized, and then turned into something sustained. Something that doesn't rely on one decisive moment, but on continuous pressure over time. And that kind of shift changes everything. Because a short campaign depends on speed, but a long one, it depends on endurance, resources, consistency, and the ability to keep going even when things don't unfold as planned. That's a completely different challenge. And it raises a serious question. If this continues at the current pace, who's actually prepared to sustain it? Because at some point it's not just about strength anymore. It's about how long you can keep using it. And once that becomes the deciding factor, the entire balance starts to shift. But what really made this situation even more complex wasn't just what was happening on one front. It was the fact that multiple fronts were now moving at the same time. And they didn't look disconnected, they looked coordinated. At this stage I stopped thinking about this as a single conflict, because it clearly wasn't anymore. What I was seeing looked more like multiple fronts moving at the same time in different places, but somehow still connected. And that's what made it so much more complex. Because when pressure comes from one direction, it can be managed. But when it starts building from multiple sides at once, that's when things get difficult to contain. I started noticing patterns, activity increasing in different regions, different groups becoming more active, operations that didn't feel isolated anymore. They felt not identical, but aligned. Each one adding a layer of pressure, contributing to a bigger picture. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't about one decisive strike or one major breakthrough. It was about accumulation. Small pressures stacking over time, forcing constant responses, stretching over time, resources, creating a situation where there's no real pause, no reset. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to maintain control everywhere at once. Because every new front demands attention, every escalation requires a response. And eventually the question isn't just how strong you are, it becomes how many directions can you handle at the same time. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't explode all at once. It builds, quietly, steadily, until it starts affecting decisions, timing, and priorities. And that's when even small shifts can have bigger consequences. By this point I wasn't just looking at events anymore, I was looking at momentum, something that was gradually building step by step. And once momentum reaches a certain point, it becomes very hard to reverse. Which leads to the final and most important realization. This situation isn't just about what's happening right now, it's about where all of this is heading. By the time I connected all the dots, I realized this wasn't just about isolated events, or even a single conflict anymore. It was about direction, momentum, and where all of this is ultimately leading. Because when you look at everything together, the sustained strikes, the expanding reach, the pressure across land, sea, and air, and the rise of multiple active fronts, it doesn't point toward resolution. It points toward continuation, and that's the part most people aren't fully processing yet. This isn't something that fades out quickly, this is something that settles in, becomes the new normal, a situation where tension isn't temporary, it's constant, where every move is calculated, every response triggers another, and the cycle keeps going, and the longer that cycle continues, the more it reshapes the balance itself, because at some point it's no longer about who started stronger, it becomes about who adapts better, who sustains longer, who can operate under pressure without breaking. That's the phase this is moving into, not a moment of decision, but a test of endurance. And here's what I keep coming back to. If everything we've seen so far is just the beginning of that phase, then the real story isn't what's already happened, it's what comes next. Because the trajectory is already set, the patterns are already forming, and unless something changes dramatically, this doesn't slow down, it evolves. And once it evolves far enough, the outcome won't be decided by a single event, it'll be decided by everything that led up to it. If you've made it this far, you already see more than most people do. And trust me, I'll be watching closely because the next phase of this story might be the one that changes everything. Goodbye.